Autopsy doctors of Reddit, what was strangest discovery you've made while performing an autopsy? Undiagnosed widespread metastasized cancer in a college kid that had died in a bar fight gone bad. It's one of the small mysteries of my career thus far that has stuck with me. The primary mystery being how it could be that he wouldn't have noticed his condition or sought medical attention prior to his death. This was not some mere colon polyp. It was everywhere. I've had other instances before and since where you find the second place cause of death that didn't get to have its moment. Certainly a lot of older people have a thing or two in the works, but that was definitely the strangest instance of that concept. I'm not an autopsy doc. I'm a writer. DragonCon used to have a program where the state coroner for GA would come in and basically play guess how they died with pictures of bodies that he had received. Being a horror writer, I went regularly. Most memorable one for me was a torso and lower jaw, no signs of injury other than the remainder of the skull being absent. Turns out the poor guy had been changing a tire alongside 285. He stood up just as a truck went by. Truck passenger had their feet sticking out the window and accidentally kicked the guy's head off. Passenger had severely broken legs. I saw that picture in 1995 and it still bothers me. Not my personal story. But when I was in my intro to EMS class, my teacher brought in a death investigator, former autopsy examiner, to speak to our class. She told us while she worked as an autopsy examiner she got this woman who at the time mysteriously suffocated after a car accident. Apparently this woman was driving, and while she was driving she grabbed her lighter from her purse and was holding it in her mouth while she fumbled through her bag for her cigarettes. While doing this she got T-boned. The airbag went off and on the way to hospital they kept trying to put tubes down her throat to open her airway cause she was having trouble breathing. But no luck. She said when they cut open her throat during the autopsy they found her lighter jammed down there. Apparently when the airbag went off it got jammed down her throat and no one knew. When my mom took gross anatomy, her professor pointed out that the cadaver had a blood vessel that went through the tricep instead of around it like it was supposed to. The professor said that the students would probably never see that again because it is very rare. When I was a med student our cadaver had a thumb-sized lump in his scrotum. I thought we'd discover a tumor. When I dissected and cut open the scrotum there was a plastic object. It turned out to be a penile implant. Our professor had me dissect the entire implant out and everyone else went to our table and I had to show them the entire contraption. Reservoir, cylinders and all. I was later called the penile implant guy. No, I didn't become a urologist. Not a doctor, autopsy tech. Nothing particularly strange. Mostly suicides and natural deaths. The strange thing is when you start working there suddenly all the patients are around your age. It's just coincidence but feels freaky. I was 19 and had several cases that were under 21. Luckily never any kids. One guy died behind the wheel and crashed into a Cadillac dealership. Ended up totaling several cars. Listen to your doctor if they tell you to do something. Like walking after a bone break. If you sit on a chair and never walk you could end up with a blood clot that breaks off and kills you via pulmonary embolism. Person had several thumb-sized DVTs in her cuffs and one in the lung. Also don't be afraid to get help if you're suffering. Suicide isn't the answer. I met a medical examiner at a friend's party recently, and he told us that once he received the body of a cheese factory worker who fell and drowned/burned in molten cheese. It was super awkward as the corpse they received was embedded in a chunk of cheese as it had cooled down. It felt like carving out a corpse from the leftovers of a fondue, French molten cheese dish. It was his top one. Forensic histopathology and autopsy tech here. I've seen really enlarged hearts. Mostly due to myocarditis. Mostly what we call NASH deaths, natural, accidental, suicide, homicide. But nothing was strange enough that I haven't seen it at least twice. When I was in EMS training we had to do ME rotations to learn gross anatomy. The ME told us of a case they had the previous month where they had an unattended death in a rental property of a single 40-something person with no known medical history. Autopsy was unremarkable until the labs came back, carbon monoxide poisoning. They reported it back to the police who investigated. Turned out his heating system had a weird malfunction that would emit massive amounts of CO. In this case the autopsy saved someone else's life as the heating system was fixed to avoid it from potentially killing the next renter. During gross anatomy in medical/dental school, one of the cadavers had a cock pump with an external pump that you could squeeze and fill his member up. Needless to say, it got a lot of attention from both faculty and staff. Back in gross anatomy I was cutting into my guy's butt. This guy had so much fat. If you didn't know, fat is yellow. I finally separate the sea of yellow from his red muscles, and as I'm parting his muscles I see more yellow deep in his glutamus maximus. I'm thinking, WFT is this? How the FK does this guy have fat under his muscles? I pull it out and it ended up being a massive lipoma. Could easily fill a C cup. But don't think that's why he died. His lungs were pretty fucked up, so I think he was a smoker. Not human corpses, but did a few necropsies on animals and found some odd stuff. Majority of it was cancer, heart failure, or odd accidents. Very rarely was it something horrifying. Had a cat that only was born with one kidney and it was too small, looked like it stopped developing while young. Had a dog that best described looked like a train wreck. It had multiple surgeries from swallowing random objects and did a number on the digestive tract when it got older. Could see where intestine in multiple spots were removed and put together again. Had a tortoise have hay shoved up its nose and best described only one functional nostril. It was completely blocked the body encased the foreign object. It passed from poor nutrition. Had a bird managed to swallow a squeaker from a dog toy. Not sure how no one noticed that. Fish also will swallow anything. Top 5 were ping pong balls, those small solid figures, a ballpoint pen, small Christmas ornament, and a fake rose. I've seen bone cancer that spread to a young person's lung, which basically replaced the whole lung with bone. I had to saw the lung in half with a bone saw to get samples. Another lady with cirrhosis died, and when she arrived she had a distended belly. We assumed it was due to ascites secondary to her cirrhosis, but when we opened her abdomen this thick, clear, gelatinous mucus poured out. We measured it at over 2 liters of this sticky gel. Turns out she had an undiagnosed mucinous tumor of her ovary, which had spread all throughout her abdomen. Icky. Not a doctor or autopsy tech, but I am a funeral director, embalmer. In school we went to a cadaver lab that has about 8 bodies, all preserved and pre-dissected in various ways. One was dissected right down the middle, a table of just a bunch of limbs, etc. There was one decedent who had situs inversus, which means that their inside structure in their torso and abdomen are on the opposite side of the normal positioning. This was discovered in this person's life because they went in for an appendectomy and the doctors started looking around on the right side and couldn't find anything, looked on the left side and there was the appendix. It's a genetic mutation, and most people who have it don't actually know they have it, as it wouldn't pose any health issues. I've had the opportunity to attend a couple of autopsies. One thing I will never forget is the first time you see them put the scalpel in to make the initial Y cut that goes from the clavicle to the pubis. It's such a strange sight to see someone nonchalantly stick a knife into someone's skin so deeply and cut like it's going through butter. And the fact that there is no blood makes it all that much more strange. It's also strange to see the food that the decedent ate. It stops digesting, so if they had just eaten shortly before death, you get some interesting stuff. One person had been at a party and ate potato salad but had clearly just kind of gulped it down. Big chunks of unchewed food that you could have put into a container and no one would have even known it was actually consumed already. When they got the tree loppers out to cut the rib cage open, that was another treat. Totally unexpected. It wasn't an actual tree lopper, but it was the exact nomenclature of one. Just a little shinier and seemed to be a lot better built. As a student in dental school gross anatomy lab. We were dissecting the throat. Upon entering the larynx we discovered a tooth the PT had swallowed. The tooth was lodged over epiglottis and we got to change the cause of death to choked on foreign substance. All cadavers were treated with the utmost respect. My dad was the doc tasked by the county to perform autopsies. He probably did over 100 in his career. He eventually quit because of how gruesome the job was. Children dying in a house fire, suicides with a gun to the head, torn limbs from farming accidents, etc. He smelled terrible for days after coming home due to the formaldehyde. After a while that kinda job catches up. One weird case he had was a man was sitting in his pickup truck and a stray hunting bullet went through his window, through his gut, and out the other side. Dude bleed out on sight. Come over to /r/forensic pathology if you want to talk more about this super cool field. Autopsy for sudden and suspicious death, no experience necessary. We're all more friendly than TV might have you believe. Except Psych, he played the fun of being and me just right. 8 kilograms liver, hepatomegaly, because of micrometastasis of urothelial carcinoma. Med student here. The cadaver we were dissecting lacked a muscle called the palmaris longus. For those not familiar, it's the most superficial muscle of the forearm. You can see it as cord-like structure in your wrist that rises when you try to make a claw with your hand. On dissecting the other limb, we discovered that the agenesis was bilateral. Where I'm from, the first part we dissect is the upper limb. So usually during this stage students are pretty inexperienced and haven't yet been exposed to a lot of variations in the body. So discovering this was quite fascinating. Later on, when we reached the thorax, we also found that he had 3 lobes in his left lung and 2 in his right. Usually the opposite is found. Once, I sent a cow for autopsy after it died suddenly. The report came back that there was a wire in its heart, not hugely uncommon. They work through from the digestive tract, but also that this cow had a deflated football in its stomach which had been there for some time and did not appear to hinder digestion. The other day I autopsied a decomposed mid-50s lady with a small plastic container in her rectum filled with a clear liquid. I tried using a urine drug screen card to test it, but it did not work. Not a doctor but at an autopsy have had to ask if we measure the decedent from top of head to soles of feet. How do I measure someone without a head? Ended up using the height on his driver's license with a notation on Y. Also, not strange, but oftentimes if you don't use a large enough caliber the bullet just bounces around in your skull. Usually you die after a bit, not almost instantly. But the number of suicides where the person has already attempted suicide by GSW to the head and lived was shocking. No head dude mentioned had already tried once with tiny bullet and just mostly damaged the sides of his head and needed plastic surgery. Clearly he picked a larger size his next attempt. Just here to recommend to all of you the book Unnatural Causes by Richard Shepard. Very fascinating insight in forensic pathology. If these guys would really open up you'd read some incredible stories. Unknown brain tumor may have caused them to swerve into traffic due to location. Second/different case, pregnancy and murder victim. Made it a double homicide. We had this guy who had some heart issues, came to the hospital with some heart failure symptoms, got progressively worse and then just couldn't go anymore. This guy had extensive imaging, testing, the whole deal. Well, when we were doing the organs, everything looked fairly okay, even the heart didn't look that bad for the picture they gave us. Then, I slice open the liver, which was admittedly a bit larger than normal, and boom, it was about 80% replaced by a nasty abscess. I'm talking liters of pus. He didn't have a fever, they didn't see anything on imaging, clinical or even blood cultures. We were never sure if the heart issues were maybe worsened before he got to become septic, but that is still the largest liver abscess I've seen in my life. Just a bit ago, I was in a human anatomy class where they worked with cadavers. The one my class worked on died due to heart issues. What exactly they said, I don't really remember now. However, when we cut open the thorax and abdomen to get to the GI tract and heart and lungs, a tumor had grown in the mesentery of the small intestine and lived in its own pocket, pushed and pierced through the diaphragm, and squished up near the heart. Looks like it was a misdiagnosis that ended up taking her life. The doctors were close, but it looks like they never got around to seeing if she had any tumor issues. I mainly deal with perinatal autopsies, stillbirths and neonatal deaths, but one time I did an adult as a favor because the other pathologist on duty was the neighbor of the deceased. The neighbor had a known tumor and declined any investigation into what it was because they thought it would be incurable. Sadly it ended up being a very easily treatable tumor, and a small biopsy would have easily diagnosed it. Details deliberately vague to protect identities. Dude who compulsively ate coins had about $7 of change in his digestive system when we opened him up. He died choking on a quarter. I like to believe he died doing what he loved. Autopsy tech. We had a guy a few months ago that was putting off going to the hospital. Died in the car on a road trip. Anyway, his right lung and liver were decomposing. He had this really nasty pus in his right shoulder too. We were calling him zombie guy. Had a guy who was speeding on his motorcycle, bounced off a semi and slammed into a stop sign. Internal decapitation. That was pretty cool. My friend had 2 cases in a row that had auxiliary spleens. Someone tell me the odds. I can't math. Nothing to do with my previous post, but I once dated a mortuary tech, an undertaker, and she said the weirdest thing she ever encountered was that organs can shift in a human body, or maybe I am not remembering it correctly and it was a case where the person was born with mirror organs. Also, on a side note, she had a really killer sense of humor. The only reason we are not together today is that her fiancé didn't approve. LOL. None of these, but I saw weird anatomy and I'll jump in. My grandpa has a 150 grams prostate. They misdiagnosed it as cancer several times. Please don't let 300 of these 322 comments be people correcting the op title spelling. I want some autopsy stories, damn it. I'm not a doctor, I just think I should cite an interesting case. A man here in Brazil died and his stomach was very swollen. On autopsy they found 15 or 20 kilograms of the drug in his rectum and stomach. I'm not a pathologist, but when I was in medical school we had a cadaver that died from mucormycosis. Fairly rare, but not unheard of. His face was disfigured from it. A young cadaver too, only in his 40s. Most cadavers are elderly specimens. That would be a pathologist. The body woke up. Mercifully there seems to be some guesswork in these timelines and there's genetics at play also, but I'm literally not eating so it can't be wildly wrong. I've been told by the local hospital there's no point in turning up. I'm beyond them and they can offer nothing but fluids. I'm 600 kilometers away from a hospital that can actually deal. COVID seems to be a factor. The clinic with the September appointment seemed to have blamed me when I couldn't turn up when my country went into lockdown. A specialist recently told me he thinks because I am a very complex patient, people would rather pass the buck than deal. I personally feel like they are literally waiting me out. I'm a problem that will go away eventually if ignored. I hate being a burden to my husband and son, but I am. I wasn't a medical examiner, but I assisted as an autopsy tech to help pay for mortuary school, and this has always stayed with me. This 13-year-old girl and her mother had been killed in a car accident. As standard procedure, I was removing the girl's clothes and processing the body. I noticed a bulge in her underwear. When the underwear was removed, her unborn baby was half out of her, between her legs. We were like, WTF? The last thing I expected from a 13-year-old was a baby sticking out. Later in the autopsy, it was determined that her seatbelt was positioned too high and at impact, the force upon the abdomen expelled the baby. Her underwear and pants kept the baby from being fully expelled. Remember that scene in House? When this jerk prosecutor updated the autopsy report. Not an autopsy doctor just going to say autopsy are gross. Death doesn't bother me. I've seen people die before. I live in a military family, but mutilating bodies that are already dead is just weird, and it's also very violating that you have no choice but to undergo an autopsy after death. You can't opt out. I guess I'm just going to crawl into a secret hideout when I'm about to die. Finding the person is still alive. I once did an autopsy and found an entire skeleton hidden inside someone's body. Top 1. Thank you for watching. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe. Also, leave a comment to suggest what video we should do next. Please check some of our other videos out.